The network is committed to bridging the gap in research and policy around the issue of internal displacement. As we know, there has been significant attention to issues around forced displacement globally at various levels of governance, including at the level of the United Nations, at the level of the African Union, within various sub-regional institutions across the continent, and of course, very importantly, at the national level as well. But in all of these engagements, there has significantly arisen the need for building momentum to the issue to ensure that there is sustained action around the issue of internal displacement. And of course, in relation to the pertinence of policy and research, the GENIDA project emerged, which is an international collaboration between the University of Pretoria and the University of London, funded by the UK Research and Innovation. And it's over the last couple of months, GENIDA has been involved in working with policymakers, but more importantly as well working with academics and working to build momentum at the national level in the furtherance of internal displacement in Africa. Of course, you might know very much about the news in relation to the population of persons affected across the continent. And really, when we speak about the population here, we're speaking about persons in excess of about 16, 17 million persons, especially when we speak about the issue of conflict, which is a primary driver of internal displacement in Africa. But conflict is not the only driver of internal displacement in Africa. There are various drivers of internal displacement. And in fact, when you look at the United Nations Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, which was developed in 1998, but more importantly as well the African Union Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons in Africa, also known as the Kampala Convention, which is adopted by the African Union Assembly, which is the Assembly of Heads of State and Government on the continent, in 2009 in Kampala. When you look at this particular frameworks, you are quickly drawn to the pertinent reflection of these frameworks around the need not just to build sustainable solutions to the issue of internal displacement, but then also to ensure that when we are building the solutions, we're very intentional about strategies towards the furtherance of IDP issues. And of course, we've seen that in terms of the definition of what an IDP is, these are persons, a group of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee their homes or places of arbitrary residence. And of course, have not crossed international borders, so being very pertinent in terms of how we look at internal displacement. But when you look at these frameworks, you're quickly drawn to the fact that there is a very significant emphasis on the need for state action, but also for actions by various stakeholders, not least, of course, across the state, across various levels of governance in addressing the issue of internal displacement. But then you're also drawn to the imperativeness for the need to ensure that actors beyond the state as well are held to account. But then coming back to the issue of root causes, very importantly, when we look at these frameworks, we also see that various root causes of internal displacement also relate to, also include natural disasters. We have the issue of climate change, which is emphasized in the Kampala Convention. We also have the issue of harmful practices, which is very significantly reflected in the Kampala Convention as well, and of course quite an innovative way of building on pertinent root causes that we've seen across the continent over the last couple of decades. But the point being made here is that there are various root causes of internal displacement across the continent, but then in terms of the statistics, the data on them, we don't really have as much, in fact. And one could say, but why don't we have as much data on these issues? Now, we must first begin by saying that the data we have around conflict, persons affected by conflict, is very useful and important, and of course it gives us that premise on which to understand the magnitude of the problem in relation to conflict, and of course giving us that pertinent understanding that this is also an issue that is prevalent across various regions, various countries in the continent. But it's important for us to have those data also in relation to natural disasters, in relation to climate change, in relation to harmful practices. Very importantly, because having those data could help us in terms of planning strategic solutions to these issues. But we really can't begin to speak about having data, if we don't really understand the issues inherent in these forms of root causes of internal displacement. And indeed, that is why there's a need for research around these issues, because the research we gather would help us understand what issues are there. So I'll give an example. For instance, when we speak about climate change and internal displacement, there's often the question around how do we even know that climate change is resulting in internal displacement, and that's a question that perhaps comes from a place that there's a need for research around. But what we've seen over the last couple of decades are just four pertinent issues that really come up. So we see slow onset disasters, and we see the exacerbation of these onset disasters given the impact of climate change. We also see sudden onset disasters, and this is really where we see a lot of momentum being built around, especially because we do have torrential rainfalls in various parts of the continent, we have hurricanes, and these are issues that really just draw attention to the need for disaster management and response. But then the exacerbation of it being as a result of climate change, and the fact that this also leads to situations of internal displacement, makes us then have significant need to build that momentum around protecting persons who are affected by climate change in the context of internal displacement. But then also we see climate conflict, and this is really where we start seeing the fact that scarcity of resources due to climate change then creates conflicts between certain populations. So we've seen this, for instance, between agrarian and pastoralist populations in some parts of society, and oftentimes these issues are not significantly discussed within the paradigm of the context really of climate change and internal displacement, which is very important for us to begin to discuss in order to develop durable solutions to these issues going forward. But more importantly, we also see climate projects intersecting with situations of development-induced displacement. So, for instance, responses to climate change, such as climate mitigation and climate adaptation, very important. But then also these situations resulting in situations of internal displacement, which need also to be addressed, from position of prevention, but more importantly, needs to be addressed from the position of protection of those being displaced. And of course, the arguments around the fact that we do need this climate change project in order to effectively respond to the impact of climate change is a legitimate one. But in the process of doing this project, it is important for us not to displace persons. And of course, balancing those imperatives are very useful in the context of internal displacement. But then when we look at these situations, now we see that, of course, we are now beginning to identify some pertinent situations of climate change and internal displacement intersections. And having such knowledge formations is imperative and integral to building sustainable solutions, which is also where the Global Engagement Network on Internal Displacement seeks to significantly create a level of knowledge around. But more importantly, it should show us that it is important also to begin to build national solutions and really build data around these issues across the continent, in various countries, because we also need to be very contextual in how we develop our solutions, as much as we are also holistic across the continent in order, and of course globally, in order to ensure that our actions resound within the significant global paradigm of change and durable solutions and building sustainable solutions. And importantly as well, it is important that when we think through solutions and we reflect on solutions, we are also mindful of the need to ensure that we put IDPs, internal displaced persons, at the center of whatever interventions we have. It's important for us to put them at the center of whatever interventions we have, because these are the persons that are integral to whatever solutions that we eventually get. So it would matter, for instance, how much we involve IDPs in order to ensure that we do not create protracted situations of internal displacement, but it will also matter in terms of how we involve IDPs to ensure that when we build sustainable solutions, these solutions are also owned by these persons, and they do not create other forms of displacement, given the fact that they are not accepted within societies and communities. And of course, while we build solutions, it is important for us to also remember host communities as well. Perhaps in situations where IDPs decide to locally integrate in order to ensure that we build social cohesion within those regions. But then, speaking about durable solutions to the issue of internal displacement, it's important to speak about this and to really highlight the fact that we have three forms of solutions. So we have local integration, we have return, and we have resettlement. And really, when we speak about these durable solutions, it's important for us to also emphasize that IDPs have to be at the center of this, and they need to choose what solutions they want. Of course, we've seen in various countries where IDPs decide to return back to the place of their homes or places of habitual residence, perhaps in situations of conflict, when the conflict is over. But it's important that in terms of arriving at the solutions, it's not something that is forced on them, but rather it's something they decide by themselves in order to ensure that it's much more sustainable, and that it essentially helps them to rebuild their livelihood capacities and support. And so what should matter most in terms of how we even move forward in the conversation across the continent, but then also globally, is what can you do in ensuring that internally displaced persons are protected in Africa. Of course, we have the frameworks, which is very important and gives us a basis on which to begin the conversation. But then beyond the frameworks, what do you want to do within your own space, within your own vantage points? That's very important as well in building solutions to internal displacement. And it's important to emphasize that when we speak about the rights of IDPs, the Kampala Convention, for instance, speaks very strongly about the rights not to be arbitrarily displaced. And this is really one that encapsulates the context of internal displacement to ensure that in situations of internal displacement, IDPs are protected, and not just that they are protected as the starting points, but then prevention is really the starting point, where state has to ensure that it provides the adequate structures that are important in order to ensure that situations of internal displacement do not occur. But when they occur, there is a need to ensure that protection is given in accordance with the Kampala Convention, but then also one that contextually looks at the nature of the internal displacement. And I'll give an example. So, for instance, you have a person who has been displaced by an harmful practice in a particular community, and in order to ensure that that person also receives protection, the Kampala Convention, of course, specifically speaks about certain provisions in terms of protection assistance, but it's also important for the state to ensure that there's psychosocial support integrally within the context of providing protection for those persons. And of course, psychosocial support is important when we also think about other forms of displacement, such as armed conflict or even natural disasters, because such situations could also create pertinent challenges. But overall, it is important that the context of displacement also informs pertinent solutions.
I came across a topic about internal displacement around 2009, I think during the Kampala Convention, and I got interested in the topic, although it's not entirely my area of interest. I teach media, communication, and cultural studies. So, being my area of interest, that tackles or centers on a lot of issues in society, pretty much the sociology of the society, because in all our cultural environments, we need to communicate. Culture is through communication, and communication, we call it culture. So I've been interested in looking at how the issues of internal displacement are recorded and reported, because by and large, these areas are neglected. They are not really in the mainstream media, so to say. So what I've noticed is that the lack of discussion around these issues, by and large, because most of our governments in Africa tend to agree to protocols. So, for example, the Kampala Convention, but in practice, they are not fully engaged in the issues. And this has become one of the major areas that we need to focus on, because lack of policies, lack of regulation, and lack of discussion within the offices of power or governments means that the media rarely cover these issues. And I think one of the ways in which I think we should be thinking about this also is to look at how we could have some sort of stakeholder environment in which we have NGOs, academia, the government, as well as the media working together in trying to look at the interests of IDPs. By and large, media has a huge role in society because everything is communicated through the media. So in this case, we are talking about the media that should be interested in the plight of other people in the country. Broadcasting is particularly important in Africa because majority of our people can't read newspapers. Those who can, maybe they can't afford it. Most people don't have access to the televisions, they don't have access to the internet these days, so the radio is crucial. And largely, most African governments really have what is called a three-tier broadcasting system. This is very good to allow different information to get through. So we have community broadcasting to broadcast for a narrow group of people in society, so whether at local level or group of interest. Then you have commercial media, they can do business as a media, but crucially we have public media, which is supposed to work in the interest of the public. It's publicly funded, but the problem with this is that radio or broadcasting be a core source of information in Africa. these channels remain firmly in the hands of the government. And by the government, in most cases, we are talking about the executive arm of the government. So they are not entirely free. So what happens in this case is that because they are in the hands of the government, strongly controlled, these media institutions tend to cover issues that they think or they know that is entirely in the interest of the government. So again, this is to emphasize that to have the question of internal displacement in Africa being discussed, we really need to make this a core issue at the heart of the government. One of the key areas is to, if not force, at least negotiate to have policies, because in absence of policies, it's very difficult to negotiate. We have nowhere to start from. But if governments are forced, or they are actually sensitized in coming up with policies and laws, at least you have somewhere to start from, because you can point at something. So it's kind of what you may call maybe a chicken and egg situation. What comes first? Should the media start really covering these issues to sensitize the government, or we need to sensitize the government as civil society, as academia, that we need to have a discussion around these issues? It's very difficult, but I think as we think of having a multi-stakeholder sort of grouping across Africa, we may also need to consider that media is a crucial partner in this, not just when we need interviews and all that, but as part of the strategy that we need to get the information out there. So this is one of the areas I think that we need to really focus on, because up to today, most people will not tell you actually that when you're talking about issues of displacement, issues of migration, the biggest migration happens within Africa. But we tend to have this understanding that Africans are running away from the continent, going to Italy and whatnot. But that's a minor issue when you're looking at what is happening within. All this sort of misinformation happens because we are not really discussing this from a media perspective.
The typical functions of a university, of course, is to research, after researching, to disseminate that research through teaching, through publications, through trainings and any other fora. But a university cannot be aloof to the environment around it. A university must be useful to the community. Hence, the bigger purpose of a university would be community service. As a law school, we engaged in that. And then the university has a clinic which would be beneficial to especially indigent people in the surrounding who might need representation, who might need legal advice. And that's exactly what a university is wired to do. Specifically on matters of internal displacement, it's not possible that a university can ignore a problem of this magnitude. And our law school has taken it up to research the problem, not just in Kenya but regionally. Where are the gaps? What can we do differently in the future? And you realize that this is something that will need partners. Hence, GENIDA and the involvement of the University of Victoria as well, to start looking for solutions together to the problem of displacements in Africa. Kenya is not isolated. It faces nearly similar problems as other African countries in terms of displacement. And we have had issues, for example, related to election violence, which causes a lot of displacements, conflicts related, for example, between communities, maybe cat rustling or stuff like that. And then communities have been displaced. We've had natural disasters, for example, floods, even in this region where our university is situated, a lot of flooding in the area. We've had other disasters in the region. For example, in Congo, you saw that. We had volcanoes. Such situations, of course, bring about displacements. Still in Kenya, we have the issues of land. Land is still a very volatile issue. And the problem of squatters and landlords is a big problem that we keep thinking about. And oftentimes, when the landlords, of course, put the whip or crack on the squatters, we end up with displacements. And so it's a major problem even within our own environment that we must get involved in. And then through this partnership, we're hoping that we shall research more the causes of these problems. We shall research more possibilities. Where are the gaps in our laws? Where are the gaps in our policies? Strategic direction we could take, maybe as a country. And this will involve not just research, therefore, but also policy, advocacy. It will involve training, public awareness, and so forth and so on. But I think the bottom line is that we have to find solutions. We can't ignore a problem that is right in our eyes.
Generally, about IDPs and legal frameworks, especially within the African continent, I must confess that we're still lagging behind as a continent, notwithstanding the fact that we have already a convention, an AU convention that protects the rights of IDPs in the continent. But many African countries are yet to domesticate that framework, even though they've signed. And Sierra Leone is one country, and we have made some progress in terms of having institutional frameworks, but yet we are lagging behind in terms of domestication. And this is the case for many African countries, say a few like Kenya, that have done well in terms of domesticating the convention. And when we don't have laws, policies, and institutional frameworks in place, then it becomes very difficult to protect and assist IDPs, across the continent. Why is law so important? Because it's the first step. In the absence of a law, we cannot hold our government accountable. They will just be relying on policies and also treat IDPs as charitable objects. And when they fail to secure assistance or protect their rights, we cannot enforce against the state because we don't have a framework that we can rely on to compel compliance. That is why it's important for governments to not only sign to the AU Convention on the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons that was passed in 2009, but they have to also take steps at the national level to have existing framework to domesticate the convention so that they can hold themselves to account, and it becomes a right-based approach in dealing with IDPs going forward. So Sierra Leone is making some steps in terms of recently we have developed an action plan at the very least to provide a roadmap, a direction, and a focus so that the government will, going forward, be able to understand how progressively they can realize the rights of IDPs in the country. The National Action Plan has now been submitted to the Human Rights Commission of Sierra Leone, and they have agreed to serve as lead agency in providing advocacy, lobbying for acceptance and implementation of the National Action Plan. But then how did we get to the National Action Plan? It was a long process, so we had to organize a 2-day stakeholders conference and invited all stakeholders. So it's important for National Action Plans to incorporate several actors so that at the end of the day, there will be a buy-in by state and non-state actors. So in that 2-day summit, we invited the MDAs, Ministry Partner Agencies, we invited civil society, we invited the community, we also invited the religious community, the local authorities, and then the IDPs themselves were there. So we cannot make policies and action plans for them if they are not a part of it. So they were also on the table, they gave their input as to what the action plan should entail regarding their rights and their needs. So after the 2-day program, we were able to have a draft, which was validated by all the stakeholders at the time of the conference, and we even involved the Human Rights Commission because we saw the whole engagement as a human rights issue. IDP protection and assistance is relatively a human rights issue, and the Human Rights Commission made an undertaking that they are pleased to be a part of this process, and they will take the lead to advocate and lobby for support for IDPs. So we brought also people who have been affected in Sierra Leone. We've had several instances that led to internal displacement. For example, we had the Ebola crisis, we had the coronavirus now, and of course we also had landslide. The whole community was wiped. Over 500,000 people were displaced, and over 1,000 people were killed when there was a landslide in our community. And so recently, in fact, there was an inferno that led to 1,000 people being displaced. The government lacked a national action plan, and so the response were largely on a charitable basis. And so this action plan we have now drafted is welcoming, and it has provided a roadmap on how to deal with these issues on a progressive realization basis. And the IDPs themselves are now better placed to claim their rights, because there is now a document to which they can reference when they call for much more support from the government. So it's important for states across the continent to understand that action plans are good, and they can help to incentivize the change that is required for IDP protection and assistance. The UN Guiding Principle on Internal Displacement is calling for states to develop action plans, as well as the AU Convention. So it's important that governments across the world take steps and develop action plans, policies, and eventually have laws that will hold themselves to account when they fail to adequately protect and assist internally displaced persons within their jurisdiction. And another thing that is important to also know in this discourse is the fact that sustainability and durable solutions are very key in driving the required changes that we need in terms of protecting and assisting IDPs. What do I mean by this? So what we did in Sierra Leone, after we developed the action plan, we did not only stop there. We went further to form a working group. So governments should also ensure that working groups exist, and this is particularly a call for CSOs. So when we finished having the plan, we formed a working group, a GENIDA working group on IDPs in Sierra Leone, and that working group is currently tasked with the responsibility of advocating and pushing for implementation of the action plan. So it's a civil society-led initiative. So when the government now fails in terms of following the action plan and the activities thereon, there is a body that will call them to attention. And that's how we get to durable and sustainable solutions. If we don't have a body that monitors and calls for speedy implementation of the action plan, then it will be another document that just sitting down there and no action will be taken on it. So the working group is currently engaging in advocating and pushing for implementation of the action plan. So that's a durable way of holding to account our governments when they fail to take steps in line with the action plans they've endorsed regarding IDP protection and assistance. So it's important for African states to also understand how to do these things. So durable solutions could also mean engaging networks, having in place working groups that will continue the advocacy, the training, and also the engagement of IDPs. And we've also pledged as a working group to be holding sessional meetings with IDPs themselves to train them on the frameworks and how to claim their rights. Because if they don't know their rights, they cannot easily claim them. So how they can get to that is by engaging them with training, advocacy, and also education, and making them own the process in terms of calling for more support regarding their situations. And then we are planning also down the line to push for policy and then, of course, eventually a law on IDP protection. But gradually, on a case-by-case basis and in a progressive way, we are making progress as a nation. So this is the call that we may want to extend to other countries that are lagging behind. Remember, the AU has opened us up to having a whole convention on IDP protection. It is now the responsibility and duty, I would say, of states to take further step in ensuring that frameworks exist, at the very least, a national action plan, to start the discussion on how we can get to durable solutions in terms of protecting and assisting IDPs in the continent. So as a human rights advocate, this is my call. It's time for states to look at this issue from a human rights-based approach. The approach has been largely charitable. These people are human beings. IDPs are human beings. They deserve dignity and respect in the way we treat their issues. And it's enough a time for us to stop seeing them as charitable objects, where when the incidents occur, we just go and visit them once in a while, carry food, mattress and you name it, and then just disappear, and don't even think about them anymore. So the one-stop approach is something we must resist. There must be durable solutions. They must be treated as human beings. Their right to health, their right to life, their right to affordable housing is key, and we must ensure that when these situations occur that forces them to be displaced internally, we find durable solutions and ensure that they are treated as human beings and their rights are respected, going forward.
In a typical setup of society, there are three sectors. We have the government, we have the private sector, and then we have the civil society. Normally, that third category deals with issues that affect especially marginalized groups, and in their advocacy front, they normally gather evidences on that particular issue or subject matter that they want to advocate for. Now, in this particular context of internal displacement, if we are to define what internal displacement means, it is actually a state whereby people or a person or group of persons are actually forced to leave their place because of certain factors. Yesterday on my presentation, I talked of push and pull factors, but in most cases it's always the push factors that contribute towards somebody leaving. Now, internal displacement, it's when somebody doesn't actually cross or leave an international recognized border. And that's the difference between internally displaced person and refugees. The refugee in this aspect, it's somebody living or group of people leaving a country and they will have crossed an international recognized border. So as civil society organization, what should be the role that we should play in advocating for issues that affect people or groups of people who are internally displaced? We must always have the facts at the fingertips. We must have the statistics. We must have the evidences. In that way, position us to actually advocate meaningfully and to have actually maximum impact. And then we can only do that if we ally with other stakeholders in the community or whichever jurisdiction we intend to have our advocacy issues. As an organization, there are a number of things that we've been engaged in concerning internal displacement. In Uganda, we are actually working with two groups, formerly internally displaced persons, because the war has come to an end and people have gone back to their homes, but we are still working with the group. And then we are also working with other groups who have actually been formerly displaced, but again, there are categories whereby the issues that affect them needs to be advocated for, and it's actually the responsibility of government to take such initiatives that will address the concern of those categories of people, especially the young people, those who actually were born in the camps, because they don't have where to go. They do not know the boundaries of their land. Maybe in one or the other, the parents could have died or could have been killed during the war. So there are those categories of people, and they are within the town, actually on the streets. So those are the two categories of people that we work with in advocating for their plight.
Comme action principale au sein de notre organisation, nous focalisons sur la situation des personnes déplacées, et des réfugiés et des rapatriés d'assistance au Burundi. Nous avons préféré prioriser ces actions parce qu'on a compris que la situation des personnes déplacées au niveau du pays est une situation qui est complètement oubliée souvent, parce que les actions qui sont développées ne vise que des personnes, surtout réfugiées, alors que les déplacés internes sont complètement laissés à elles-mêmes. C'est pourquoi nous, on a compris qu'il fallait commencer à parler de cette situation, notamment en menant des plaidoyers auprès des décideurs et des partenaires qui peuvent apporter des solutions durables à cette situation. Comme vous le savez, les personnes déplacées vivent des situations très complexes, notamment qui violent leurs droits, notamment droits économiques, droits culturels, droits politiques et consorts. Voilà, en matière de protection contre les violences basées sur le genre, surtout qui affectent les femmes dans des situations de déplacement, on constate que c'est une situation qui est vraiment répandue et qui malheureusement ne trouve pas assez d'attention auprès des partenaires. Et cela affecte ces communautés qui sont totalement déplacées et qui malheureusement n'ont pas aucune assistance. Comme vous le savez, ce sont des personnes qui ont besoin d'une assistance d'urgence, mais souvent cette assistance ne parvient pas à arriver. Je donne un exemple de la situation du Burundi où maintenant, depuis un certain temps, on observe des déplacements des populations dus au changement climatique et qui affecte beaucoup de populations, surtout de la zone Gatumba, surtout aussi d'autres provinces qui ont affecté. Cela ressort des rapports, surtout de la plateforme nationale, mais aussi de la coordination humanitaire à travers OCHA, qui publie souvent des rapports de situations de déplacés dans ce qu'on appelle aussi DTM, matrice de traçage des populations déplacées. Cela a montré que les besoins des populations déplacées sont énormes, mais que malheureusement, la mobilisation reste toujours difficile compte tenu du contexte dans lequel le pays est plongé. Mais qu'à cela ne tienne, les déplacés ne sont pas seulement au Burundi, comme on l'a constaté à travers des rapports, à travers aussi des consultations, des conférences. Et par exemple, nous venons de constater que dans une conférence organisée par le GENIDA au Kenya, la situation a été observée malheureuse au niveau du continent africain. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a peu d'interventions, c'est-à-dire qu'il n'y a pas même de politique. Même si les politiques existent, il manque de moyens d'accompagnement de ces politiques et pour leur mise en œuvre. Autre problème qu'il faut vraiment souligner, ce sont des problèmes de protection des populations déplacées et surtout liés aux moyens économiques. Donc, il y a un problème de renforcement des capacités économiques des groupes affectés, et notamment les groupes les femmes qui sont dans un besoin spécifique, et les enfants aussi, mais aussi les filles et les garçons. Cela montre que les besoins en matière d'assistance, de la protection, en matière d'hébergement, en matière de relocation sont tellement compliqués, alors que ça devrait être un besoin prioritaire pour ces groupes de personnes déplacées. Donc, il y a beaucoup à faire à ce niveau, et cela doit interpeller toute la communauté à s'engager au niveau local, au niveau national, mais régional, mais aussi international. il faut qu'on cherche des solutions durables à ces problèmes, parce que souvent, même s'il y a des agences qui interviennent, par exemple le HCR qui interviennent auprès des personnes réfugiées, et oublie souvent les interventions auprès des personnes déplacées parce qu'ils disent que ça ne rentre pas dans nos missions. Et les gouvernements souvent ignorent ces situations par manque de capacité, mais aussi par manque de moyens pour pouvoir assister ces personnes. Et vous allez voir que ces personnes, une fois déplacées, auront des difficultés à regagner leurs terres. Et souvent et parfois, ces terres sont extorquées, ces terres sont volées par d'autres. Et voire même certains membres de l'administration qui exploitent ces terres de ces personnes qui ont été déplacées. Alors, donc, on doit vraiment développer des stratégies de collaboration, des stratégies d'intervention au niveau global et au niveau national, mais qu'au niveau aussi local. Parce qu'il faut que même ces déplacés puissent interagir et comprendre leurs droits. Cela pourra quand même contribuer à la solution de cette situation au niveau des populations qui sont déplacées en Afrique. Voilà ce que je peux dire en instant, mais pour moi, je dis que notre organisation est engagée dans ce domaine et nous avons des bons résultats parce qu'on est sur le terrain, on travaille avec ces communautés, on reste ensemble, on participe à les renforcement des capacités et surtout en matière de protection qui sont notre valeur fondamentale en matière d'intervention auprès de ces personnes.
It is very important that we put policies, strategies and plans for us to mitigate the effect of displacement, especially on women and girls. I would like us to look deeply into the context of Africa. We know that most of the highest number of displaced population is in sub-Saharan Africa, and more than half of this population are women. So it is important that research, policies, funding is being given so much attention at all levels, at the global, regional, and even at local levels. Attention is given to the issues of women in displacement situation. So there are so many key issues that we can tackle within the framework of research, policy, and equally the issue of practitioners. The issue of sexual and gender-based violence is at the increase at every level of displacement. So there is need for policymakers, for researchers to dig deeper into the causes and effect of such, especially on the mental health and psychosocial issues affecting women. There's also the issue of maternal health. There's also the issue of general well-being of women in terms of displacement. So it is important that we focus attention on this and give it the needed push as we go along into the issue of the GENIDA perspective with regards to Africa. Thank you.